Biblical prophecy was never given so that we would know when something would happen. Biblical prophecy was given so that when it happened, we knew that it had happened. Take four. It's still hot. This one is covering the land of promise. Are you ready? Here we go. All right, I think I'm ready. Got everything plugged in. I got my notes, airplane mode. Do I have airplane mode? I think we're ready to go. I'm excited about this course and really nervous as well. It's intimidating. If you haven't, if this is the first one you're seeing, you need to go back and watch. There's, I think, four videos prior to this, which is going to cover some of the things I'm going to say here just immediately before we get into the land of promise, which is really significant, obviously, in eschatology. I've been nervous about this because a lot of study on it. We're going to be going through it over the next several weeks, just the whole month of December 2023, if you're going to be watching this down the road. And we're looking at what God has to say about the end times. That's what eschatology means. But what eschatology really means is, Genesis 1 and 2, God creates the heavens and the earth and, all the animals and the fish and the birds and all that, and then mankind, and his dream is launched. Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 3, it all spins off the rails. Adam and Eve go rogue. They sin. Satan's in the garden. The whole thing's a mess. And then God pronounces this prophetic declaration. This is not going to end like this. I'm going to redeem mankind. I'm going to redeem my kids. I'm redeeming this plan. And he makes this statement to the enemy. The seed that comes out of the woman, referring to the Messiah, is going to crush your head. All eschatology begins there. So I've had people over the years say, if I wanted to study eschatology, where would I start? Well, it's kind of a lifelong thing. I've been studying it like obsessively for 28 years. I felt like the Lord led me to do that, honestly. Just obsessively 28 years. And I don't feel qualified. I don't know if there's anyone that's really qualified. I mean, it's from the revelation of the Lord. It's not our intelligence. Now, obviously, knowing language and culture and study and time and all of that. I've been studying it 28 years because I'm not as bright and gifted with, intellect and, kind of language skills as most, but in the scholarly realms. But I mean, I've been passionate about it because I felt like the Lord put it on my heart. And you can do this. You can study it. Ask the Lord to give you wisdom and insight consistently going, when you're going through the scriptures. It's the person with wisdom, should receive this. Ask for wisdom to understand this. So it's when we're looking at eschatology, it is a huge kind of overarching Genesis to Revelation kind of a thing, which is one of my critiques oftentimes. And I tend to shy away from people who just have a very narrow view of eschatology based off of like a couple different passages. I mean, you might have an expert in Daniel, or someone really good in Revelation, or maybe First and Second Thessalonians, or maybe, the Abrahamic covenant that's renewed by Moses and Joshua and all of that. I mean, all of that stuff's really good, but to be quite frank, you need to know it all. I mean, God has been from the beginning to the end. He's not been distracted. He's been talking about this throughout the ages, which is why we're taking so long to go through this study. I think it's going to be like 16 different studies that we're going to be putting on our channel. So this is like a big, big, big deal. So I love that you're joining us. And I want to go through several things. One thing I want to give you, it'll start in this study. There is just... I don't have the time nor the desire, frankly, to give a 36 to 38 week study over eschatology, or write a book that no one will read. No one's going to read a big fat 800-page book. I had someone say, "You ought to write it down." In fact, I came up with this name, the Epic Saga, and all that kind of stuff. And no one's going to read that thing. No one's going to read an 800-page book. And so a lot of what I'm doing is overview, but I want to give you enough. I think that's going to, really answer some questions for you. And I'm trying to tackle certain, things that are in Scripture that are relevant to us today, which sounds weird because it all should be relevant. But there are things that we're seeing in our lifetime that no one's ever seen before. And it's really important. So I want to give you kind of an overview, and then I want to give you things to study on your own. One resource that I would love for you to study, and I've taken several. I've taken Craig Keener's course and a course out of Asbury and Olivet, Nazarene University. When I was there, took a course on eschatology. I've taken several courses. Honestly, the best course I ever took is here online. It's a 17-week study. She's done one on Daniel and on Revelation. But it's a 17-week study over the book of Daniel. And it's Evers, Evers, BibleClass.com. And it's free. I mean, it's crazy. If you go through the Revelation, I think it ends up being like 37 or 38 weeks, maybe more. I think it's later into the 30s in terms of study. And she just asked for donations, and I give her a donation every time I've taken the course. And I've taken both courses twice, and the Daniel course like 4 or 5 times. It's phenomenal. Like, she is so good. There's like handouts and graphs and things you print, and it's an audio. It's not a video. That's the thing with her stuff, but it's an audio course that she gives. But it's fantastic, and it's over Daniel. So we're going to be going through Daniel over the next couple weeks, and this is where I got a good piece of that study. Of course, there's other resources as well, but when I was studying Daniel and did my outlines and stuff, and I came back and was reading scholarly articles and commentaries, she was a definite resource. She's just really fantastic of compiling information. And I like her because she gives you her opinion, and then she's like, but these are the other opinions out there. And so I really like that. So Evers Bible Class, you need to check it out. It's really good. And so, having said that, let's really quickly begin. Today is over. Oh, this is so fun. This is so good. Today, we're going to look at the land of promise, okay? We're right at 7 minutes. I'm hoping to have it done by 30. 30 minutes is quick and done. But I want to look at the land of promise. And the land of promise is the land of Canaan that the people of Israel, before they separated into, the northern tribe of Israel and the southern tribe of Judah, they went in and possessed the land under Joshua. It's super, super significant, this transition. I mean, God's been talking about it all the way back from the time of Abraham. So we want to jump into this. And what we looked at, just really quickly to remind you, is that timing is really important for God. I can't stress enough. Hear me. I can't stress enough. God, and this is all over the Scriptures, God is not slow in keeping his promises, all this kinds of stuff, the day is like 1,000 years, 1,000 years like a day, and all this kind of language about time. God is not distracted. He's not forgot. He's not aloof. He's not open-ended. There's a definite time that he's set by his own authority. Timing is really important. So in the first 3 videos especially, and probably the third video was actually really important. We looked at the prophetic, the way of life Israel was called to live as they were leaving Egypt. Egypt was just a perverse nation. I watched a documentary just the other day. Because I love that stuff. And it was just ancient Egypt and the culture. And they had found this, they called it the first pornographic scroll. Okay. Now it was History Channel, so it's very appropriate. But they were really excited about it. The guys telling the videos, but it was just, they didn't show the scroll, of course, but they were talking about it was so deviant. It was so perverse, that they couldn't show it, and it was just every form of sexuality you could imagine was on this scroll. It was like an 8 feet long scroll. And it was just, and it led them, it kind of put some pieces together with other things that they discovered and said, oh, this is what that means. But basically it was really weird. You should go watch it. But it was almost like the sexual freedom of the Egyptians. Well, that's perverse. We're going to get to some of that here. I mean, Egypt was perverse. I mean, they were not good. They worshiped, demons, the sun god Ra. That was a big deal. And the sun was the biggest thing for them. It was what dictated the crops that they planted, the days, the morning, the evening, the afternoon, their time, all of this, So, when Israel were coming out of Egypt, they just didn't come out of the culture, that perverse culture and the worship of their gods. They came out of how they told time. And we go over this in that video again, but it's interesting because they were just 490 years in Egypt. That's like a really long time. It's longer than our country's been here. Okay. So when we came out of, when Israel came out of Egypt, it was a whole new way of life. And so God wanted them to reckon time different. So we covered that with the lunar calendar and of course the Mosaic feasts. God immediately gives them in the law when they come out of Egypt. He gives them the time frame, the timeline, the prophetic timeline of where he's going. Hear that. That's what that we covered that in that video. The Mosaic feasts, the 7 Mosaic feasts, were the timeline of human history. So you're going to meet people that are like, well, no one knows a day or the hour. That's a reference to the 5th festival. God wants you to know. Jesus criticized the leaders of Israel for not knowing the season in which they lived. I mean, we're supposed to know. God wants us to know, especially as Christians. As his kids, he wants us to know what he's doing. That's why you have all this prophetic stuff. God's not like just teasing us. Okay. So all of that we covered in the first 4 videos. And so I wanted to encourage you to go back and watch that. All of that's really, really, some of it may be dry. I tried to make it fun, but it's really, really important. And I would encourage you to really, really, throw yourself into that. The purpose of that, the purpose of those really first 3 videos is to kind of nail down God is proclaiming, God is prophesying, God is declaring, I'm going to redeem humanity. And he's telling us in advance how he's going to do it. That's what the whole prophecy is. You're going to love when we go through Daniel. We're in Daniel. We're getting into Daniel next week, and we're going to be in it for a few weeks. I mean, God's just laying out some of the details about future days, which he tells Daniel, this is for the time of the end, but I want you to write it down. Okay. You're not going to understand it, but people down the road are going to read your writings and they're going to need to hear it. So God is speaking about the future, but here's how prophecy, this is really important, okay? Biblical prophecy was never given so that we would know when something would happen. Biblical prophecy was given so that when it happened, we knew that it had happened. That's why prophecy was given. It's really significant. So again, prophecy, God didn't prophesy. He didn't tell us about a future event so that we would know when it would happen. He told us so that when it happened, we knew that it had happened. That was the whole deal with prophecy. So God comes, for instance, in Jesus' first coming, and he says, Jesus will be born of a virgin. And everybody's like, what does that mean? And just like we're looking at some of the end time stuff today and all this crazy stuff in Revelation, and there's all these knee-jerk responses of well-meaning people who are like, that's already been fulfilled, or that's imagery, or that's this. No, it's not. They said the same thing about, being born of a virgin. This is supernatural language or supernatural things that are going to take place. And that prophecy was given not so we would know, but that when the Messiah came, we would see that prophecy. Oh, born of a virgin, he's here. That's what prophecy is. Okay. So I wanted to cover that just really quickly. When we're looking at prophecy, prophecy was not given so we would know when it would happen, but that when it did happen, we would know that it happened, which is, we're going to really get to this in Matthew 24, because Jesus says over and over and over in Matthew 24, Luke 21, he says, when you see these things, do that. When you see these things, do this. That's why prophecy is given. So I'm leery of anybody that says, oh, no, this is going to happen and this is what this is. You can't really be definitive on it. And so all the way through this, And I wonder what people are going to think, because they're going to watch this and say, he's not telling us, he's just reading the passage. I'm putting some things together, but there's no way I can look and say, oh, the Antichrist, yeah, he's going to be 6'5". His name's Carl, No one knows that. No one knows. No one knew the 333 prophecies about Jesus and his first coming. Come on. No one knew that stuff. It had to happen, and those were given, so we knew it had happened. That's the deal with prophecy. All right. So they've come out of Egypt. Here's where we're at as we're going into the land of promise. The people of Israel has come out of Egypt. They've got this prophetic timeline given, their whole way of doing life and their process of living. I mean, it was so hard for that first generation. They basically rebelled against God and says, we don't want it. So you got the grandkids that are going into, going into the promised land, the next generation, under Joshua and Caleb. And so a whole new life. I want to touch on the law, and I really struggled how much of this do we go through because there is like tons of prophetic stuff in the law. The whole law itself was essentially prophetic. Okay. And it wasn't just the 10 commandments. It was, the 613, laws that were given within the first 5 books, Genesis not Genesis, but Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and Deuteronomy. These laws were given and on how they function in life. And I wrote down a few things. There was all about covenant faithfulness, how to worship God, how to treat fellow Israelites and Gentile peoples, laws for how the leaders must actually lead Israel, laws for family and social life. So when you're looking at all the aspects of the law, there's a ton to it, and it's super significant. But I really feel like, though it has implications for the second coming of Jesus, the really big deal was on the first coming of Jesus. You have the lamb in there that was sacrificed, and all the kind of details of that, and you should study it and all of that. But I want to give you just really 3 quick prophetic elements of the law, because the law was important, because it was it strongly impacted how the people of Israel were going to live when they went into the land of Canaan. Because the land of Canaan, if you thought Egypt was bad, and then we're bad, but the land of Canaan was equally as bad and worse. So the law was going to structure how they were going to walk and live with God and be different from the world in which the rest of the world, how they lived. Okay. So, first off, the major element, and Paul, the Apostle Paul, the greatest Jewish rabbi there ever was besides Jesus, he gives us in Romans chapters 2 and really chapters 1, 2, 3, all the way up, honestly, through the end of chapter 7, where he goes into obviously the new covenant of chapter 8. He covers the whole purpose of, a righteousness that's apart from the law. So he's talking about the law the whole time. But the purpose of the law, as Paul states it specifically in Romans 7:7, which we're not going to look that up, but Romans 7:7 is that it reveals sin. Okay, so that's one of the elements of the law. We would not have known what sin was except for the law. And so the law was not given to produce righteousness. The law was given to reveal sin. Because if you could be righteous by observing the law, you don't need Jesus. Let me say that again. The law was not given to produce righteousness. I mean, people all the time, they're like, I don't kill anybody. Big fan. Love it. I don't rob stores. I don't hate. I don't, that's great. But what in the world does that mean? It didn't mean you're righteous. You're observing the law. That's great. But there's more than just those. Okay. If you're actually living under the law, you have to sacrifice animals and you have to be a Jew and all this kind of stuff. The law wasn't given to produce righteousness. I'm glad people don't sin. I'm glad they don't, steal. That's all wonderful. But the law was not given to produce a righteous person. The law was given to show when you actually came under the whole constitution of the law and lived under the law, the weight of it crushed you. No one could be righteous by observing the law. Jesus alone did it because he was not born in sin. There's a whole backdrop with all of that. But the purpose of the law, as Paul says, was to reveal sin, not to produce righteousness. That's the first thing. The second aspect of the law is it taught us the whole cost of sacrifice to redeem mankind. It's going to leave that where it's at. That's important. And then, of course, the last aspect of the law was the set apartness of God's people. Now, that means one thing for us in a prophetic sense, because we're set apart. That's what sanctification means. We're set apart to God. But with the Israelites, it did mean set apart from God, not like we are, okay, because we're in a whole different covenant. But in the old covenant, it was set apart to God and sometimes against, but away from and separated from the people of the world, because they were so sinful, they were so ungodly. And God says, I'm going to set you apart to me, and you're going to be a holy people because they belong to God, and you're going to go into a holy land, the land of promise. And the reason we call it the Holy Land is because the land actually belonged to God. Just like the people of Israel belonged to God, they were his people. He chose them. They entered into covenant. The land actually entered into covenant with God. So the first premise of the law was that it was given really as it pertains to what we're talking about in regards to the land of promise, is the law was given to set boundaries for the people of Israel. And so I think I wrote down a couple things. Here it is. So the land of promise, going into the land of promise, the first thing that we have to realize, and this is really important because it's still true today. The land does not belong to Israel. The land does not belong to Israel. The land belongs to God. It is the Holy Land, just like the people of Israel are God's people. It's not that they're perfect. It's not that they're wonderful, and they are to an extent, but they were chosen by God and they're his possession. Okay. So why they're a holy people and why the land is holy is because they belong to God. So the land of promise was given to the people of Israel to steward that land, because God chose that people to produce a Messiah that was going to save a world, and the land would be given to him. The land of Israel is the inheritance of Jesus. When he comes back, he's going to go there. He's going to rule from there. So we're going to go through the book of Zechariah at some point in all these studies, and we'll see that. So just from the very beginning, the land belongs to Jesus, the Messiah. And when the people of Israel did not steward it well, they were kicked out. So that's a really, really big theme when we talk about the land of Israel, and we'll be talking about it several times throughout this series. So there was a couple of responsibilities that they had going into this land. They got the law. These are the parameters of how they're going to live, not like Egypt, of course, and not like the land of Canaan. And they're going to go in. They can't rebel against their parents. They can't worship the gods of the Canaanites. And they're going to be a witness to the judgment of the Canaanites, because the Canaanites are going down. Now, there's a passage, and if you have this, and Leland's not going to put this up on the screen, probably not going to have much stuff, might just have the passage listed up here. Leviticus 18, you can go down through the whole chapter, and this is just how bad. Verse 3 of chapter 18, God says, you must not do as they do in Egypt. Okay, I just took you out of that place. But also, middle of that verse, you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan either. And all throughout this chapter is what they are doing, the daily practices in Canaan. And it's terrible. Verse 6, no one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. And it's interesting, the whole language, and we can't go through the commentary on this because it would be judicious with time. But I mean, it's not marriage. It's just soliciting. It's like, hey, you want to hook up? Like that was common. Like that stuff happened in the land. Just approach a close relative. That's appalling to us today, but that was going on. Verse 7, don't dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mom. That seems to be obvious. It wasn't for them. Verse 8, don't have sexual relations with your father's wife. Verse 9, don't have sexual relations with your sister. Don't have sexual relations with your son's daughter. That's verse 10. It goes all the way down. These are just, and by the way, there's a ton more. This is just the sexual perversity of the land of Canaan. So he ends up going down in verse 21. He says, don't give any of your children to be sacrificed by Molech. That was one of the big deals. Don't worship their gods or sacrifice your kids. And then verse 22, don't lie with a man as one lies with a woman. That's homosexuality. It was a sin back then, just like it is today. It's a perversion. It's the wrong version of sexuality. Verse 23, do not have sexual relations with an animal. Seems pretty obvious. And then verses 24, 25, and 26, he says, do not defile yourself in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive you out before you became defiled. This is their daily lifestyle stuff. Don't do it. If you do, you're going to be punished. Okay. So going into the land of Canaan, there was some pretty, God was like, I'm separating you. And the reason these people are coming out of the land of Canaan is because that's how they live. And that's not how we're going to live. Okay. So that's Canaan. That's how bad they were. Now, when you're going into the land, it's interesting. This has been a long time coming. This is so neat. This has been a long time coming for God. He began with the covenant under Abraham. I think I got this one in here. Yeah, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The Lord comes to Abram. This is before he changed his name. And he says, leave your country, your people, and your father's household and go to the land that I'm going to show you. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you. All the nations of the world are going to be blessed by you. He's going to redeem an entire world. So God was talking about his whole, redemptive plan, telling Abraham about future, events that Abraham, it's crazy. Abraham didn't see half of this stuff, most of this stuff. I mean, he made it into the land, but not really. Like, he didn't really see this stuff. I mean, his grandson went in the land before they went to Egypt, but like, this is generations and generations and generations afterwards. You've got Joshua that's leading the Israelites in. These are his descendants. But God's telling him way in advance the things he's going to do. Okay. So he establishes this covenant and he's going to give this land. He's already talking about the land back in the Abrahamic covenant. He renews this under Moses. And I'm not going to cover all this, but Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 29, it's really some severe covenant. I'm going to read just a little bit of this. When you come into Deuteronomy chapter 28, it really begins at verse 15. Yeah, it goes down to the end of the chapter. This covenant that he makes, we're going to cover the curses for disobedience. Okay. God says, don't do any of these things. We just read that. Okay. That's in the law. Okay. Leviticus. You're going to go into this land. I'm giving you this covenant. That the law is the boundaries for these people here. There's prophetic elements of the law of Moses. Okay. The 10 Commandments, 613 laws stuff, what the Jews lived under. There's prophetic significance for us, but for them, it was the boundaries of being separated to God and not being like the nations of the world, primarily the Canaanites. They come out of Egypt. They were given the law, where they were going, the nations all throughout Canaan. You're not going to look like them. I don't want you to look like them. If you do look like them, if you rebel, this is what's going to happen to you. Dude, if you read through this, Deuteronomy 28, 29, it is brutal. Like, it's gross. He's talking about, at one point, he talks about a woman who gives baby and cooks the afterbirth for her kids because they're starving to death. There's a whole nother level of just going on in these, and this is grown up material, folks. This is the consequence of sin that he's going through. You need to read it. It's crazy. Okay. Chapter 28, 29, but beginning in verse 15 of chapter 28, he says, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I'm giving you today, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. And then he just starts going after him, your city, your land. Verse 19, you'll be cursed when you come in and cursed when you go out. Verse 21, there's going to be plagues and disease, no rain. Verse 24, you're going to be defeated by your enemies. Verse 25, you're going to be afflicted with boils of Egypt, with tumors, festering sores and itches, from which you cannot be cured. That's verse 27. 28, you're going to be mad. You're going to be mad. You're going to have madness and blindness and confusion of mind. Your sons and daughters in verse 32 are going to be given to other nations. In verse 34, it says, the sights you see will drive you mad. If you go into the land and you're like, man, I'm living the way they live, this is what's going to happen to you. Verse 35, the Lord will afflict your knees and legs with painful boils. It just goes on. It's crazy. Verse 41, you'll have sons and daughters, but you won't keep them. All these curses, verse 45, will come upon you, and they will pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed because you did not obey the Lord your God and observe the commands and decrees he gave you. Yikes. And then, of course, then there's the prophecy basically about what will happen to them when we get to Daniel and when they're in Babylon in exile. God's going to just vomit them from the land. They're not going to be a good steward. Verse 63 of Deuteronomy 28, just as it pleased the Lord to make you prosper and increase in number, so it will please him to ruin and destroy you. You will be uprooted from the land you are entering to possess. Then the Lord will scatter you among the nations from one end of the earth to the other. So again, the land belongs to God. It's his land. It's the holy land. It's an inheritance for his children, Jesus and the saints. And of course, the Jews are going to be included in that if they believe and when they believe. But if, they don't steward the land well, they're going to be exiled from it. They're going to be taken out of it and horrible judgment. So you have the covenant established with Abraham, hey, I want to give you this land. It's renewed under Moses, and then it's renewed again under Joshua. And you can read more about the details of hey, you better obey the covenant in Joshua chapter 23 and 24. And I hope you're writing these down. You need to go read and study this. It gives you a picture, a really good picture. And then, of course, I want you to hear this. It's actually Joshua 24, verses 20 through 22. Joshua reads all the things that Moses set out. So at this point, the old generation has died. You have this whole lengthy time period. They receive the law. They go to the land. They send out the spies. They're like, we're not going in there. So they end up going, spend 40 years in the wilderness. That whole generation dies. And then Joshua is taking the people. Moses is going to leave. In fact, he leaves and goes up on the mountain and dies. And Joshua is left with the next generation, and they're going to go into the promised land. And Joshua's like, listen, let's don't do what Grandma and Grandpa did. Oh, I don't want to go back to the desert. Let's go in here. No matter what's going to happen, God's going to take care of us. And they make that decision. So Joshua goes over all of the stuff that Moses did, and then he confirms it again. So that's in Joshua 23 and 24. But then he says this in chapter 24, verses 20 through 22. He says, if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. But the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua said, you are witnesses against yourself that you have chosen to serve the Lord, which sounds weird. You'd think he'd be like, we're choosing to serve the Lord. Yeah. And Joshua would be like, you're awesome. And Joshua's like in fear and trembling, you're witnesses against yourself, man. And they're like, what, are we not going to do good? I mean, it's pretty, I don't know. Yikes. I'm glad I'm a Christian and not living back in these days. Okay, so there are basically two main reasons for exile: Leviticus 26, idolatry, and Leviticus 25, abuse of the land. And I want you to read, we're not going to go through it for time, Leviticus 25, 1 through 7. The land was to receive a Sabbath rest. Now, we need to read through it. It's really important. It's really important. 1 through 7, we're not going to read through all this. But he's basically saying you need to give the land a Sabbath rest. Okay. So they were to farm. You probably already know this, but they farm the land. It's in the law. You farm the land for 6 years. And then just like in our life, for them, 6 days was work. And then they got a day of rest. Weren't allowed to work on that day. Okay. Don't do overtime, rest, have fun with your family, play some kickball. So that was the deal with their lifestyles, on a regular weekly basis. And the land had that, in terms of, and there was other like times of years of Jubilee and for paying back loans and forgiving loans and all that kind of stuff. But with the land, you were to farm the land for 6 years. And then on the 7th year, you weren't to farm it. You let the land rest. And what God would do is he would give you a double portion on the 6th year. You'd get twice the yield. And then you wouldn't have to farm for a year, which I'm like, God, that's so vacation for a year. That's great. But they didn't do it. So they took the double portion on the 6th year and then, spent that money and went to Disneyland instead of, doing what they were supposed to, and then they farmed on the 7th year. Now, so all of this talks about about doing that. But it's interesting. There's a prophecy in verses 11 and 12. The whole country will become a desolate wasteland if you don't let the land rest. And the nations will serve, and this nation will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. But when the 70 years were fulfilled, then I'm going to punish the land of Babylon. He doesn't go into the details about them going in and being rescued out, but he's talking about, the 70 years of Babylon. This is a direct reference to what's going to happen to them down the road because they're not going to let the land rest. Again, God is prophesying. He's wanting them to know. He's wanting them to succeed. He's like, this is what's going to happen, So it's probably why Joshua was so evident when he made them as a witness and testimony to themselves. Okay, so they go into the land and a lot of things happen. And I wondered about maybe doing 2 or 3 lessons. And you should go through Joshua, and Judges, and you should go to 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel, and, go through all of those history books and learn about Ruth and Naomi and you learn about all the kings and the prophets, and it just went sideways, man. They didn't do all that God wanted them to do. And in terms of driving out some of the nations, they didn't deal with the Nephilim, the mixed race of men and angels. They didn't, where the giants came from. They just didn't do what God wanted them to do. Then they got into the perversity of the kingdoms, and they intermarried, and it was a disaster until they were finally exiled. And so you can read about the prophets that are coming to them in the land of Canaan. Prophets are coming from time to time. Micah in chapter 4, verse 10, he comes and he's like, listen, man, and gives a prophecy. Babylon's going to come in and you're going to be ousted. Jeremiah comes to them and he prophesies for 20 years. Think about that. Like 20 years saying, don't stop. There's still time. And for 20 years, they wouldn't stop. And so you can read about Jeremiah's punishment and exile. He's telling them, you're going to go to Babylon. Babylon, all these different nations. They're dealing with Tyre. They're dealing with all these other nations that are around them. And it's Babylon, which is kind of like off their radar to some extent. And he's like, Babylon's going to come in. Babylon's going to come in and take care of you guys. Man, you're going to be in trouble. And he's reading to them all the things that God said back in Leviticus, and all these, all the things that they had promised, and they just had no fear. It was terrible. So you can go read about that, and it's really important. But Jeremiah 25 and 29 in particular give us the details of Israel going into the land of Babylon. And then in Jeremiah 52, verses 28 through 30, which is only a couple verses. I don't know if I did this one or not. Come on. Okay, here we go. Yeah, I did put this in here. Jeremiah 29. Oh, that's Jeremiah 29. This is a neat letter because Jeremiah, when you get to the latter parts of Jeremiah, he's actually, my title above chapter 29 is a letter to the exiles. So you're having these deep deportations. There's 3 of them that take place. And I might have actually written the time frame down on that. You'd think I'd have all this stuff memorized, but there were basically 3 deportations. We'll get to this in Daniel. That's where I wrote it down. I guess I can look at those notes. I got it right here. There were 3 different deportations of Israel: 605, 598, and 586. Those are the 3 different deportations. Daniel was out in the first one. Ezekiel was in the second one, I believe. And so anyway, Jeremiah 52, Jeremiah 29 talks about, again, the 70 years they're going to be out and come back. And this is the letter. So Jeremiah is a compilation of letters. And in Jeremiah 29, again, above this chapter, it's a letter to the exiles. So this is a letter that Jeremiah, sends, somehow gets word to the people in Babylon saying, listen, you rebelled. I've been telling you for 20 years, you didn't listen, and you're going to be there. And then he comes down And he says in verse 10 of chapter 29, this is what the Lord says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and to we quote that passage. But he's telling them, listen, I told you, and this is what God says. So he writes in a letter and he sends it to the exiles. Jeremiah is still back in Israel. Jeremiah never got deported. In fact, after the last deportation, when they came in and basically just smashed and destroyed everything in Israel, because they came in the first time and they took all the plunder out of the temple, all the gold, all the massive wealth of Israel. And then they took all the nobility, the king, and all the kind of upper echelon of people in the first deportation. The second one, they took a whole nother group of people and took the rest of the stuff. By the time they came in for the third, they just wiped everything out. And Jeremiah takes this group of survivors and he heads over to Egypt and he lives out there the remainder of his days, ends up writing letters back and forth to Israel. And this letter here makes it to Daniel. In fact, we're going to read when we get into Daniel chapter 9, Daniel's been praying and fasting because he finds this letter. I don't know if I should bring this up really quickly, but check this out. So if you happen to go to Daniel chapter 9, in the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. That's his verse. That's his letter. He's reading this letter in Daniel. And so he basically, Jeremiah sends this to Daniel. And this is like, Daniel been there for like 65, 70 years at this point. So it wasn't like he just got the letter, but he gets this letter and he's compiled all this stuff, and way long down in his life, he's reading and he's like, we're getting ready to go. He checks his calendar and looks at his watch and he's like, dude, it's been 70 years. So he starts petitioning for God to remember we're in exile. And then that's when Gabriel comes and says, listen, you're going back home and here's how it's going to work out. We're going to go through all Daniel. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. And that Gail Evers does a fantastic job with all of that. So Jeremiah, that was the last deal with Jeremiah. You can read about the three deportations in Jeremiah 52, 28 through 30. And all that took place. So there's the land of promise is really significant, and there's a ton that goes with it. If you really want to study the land of promise, you literally have to study all the prophets, not all of them, but most all the prophets. Specifically, I would study, from Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and all the prophets prior to that, back to the arrival of the people of Israel under Joshua into the land of Canaan. That is the land of promise story, and the story of a people that made covenant with God for prophetic purposes of redeeming a world, bringing a Messiah, and they abandoned it for sin and ungodliness. Sad stuff. Hey, I hope you liked it. 41 minutes is a little bit long. I apologize. But we're going to get, this is, you'll be watching this on Tuesday, just in a couple days. I just got back in the studio to do some of these studies. But on Thursday, so just a couple days after that, end of next week, we're going to go right into Daniel. And so we're going to be in Daniel probably 2 to 3 weeks. And we're going to look at the 4 empires in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7 of world history. And we're going to look at a little bit of the return back into the promised land and the timing element with all of that. And then also the first real descriptions of the Antichrist that are given in Scripture are given from Daniel. So it's good stuff. Hope you enjoyed it. Bless you guys.